All right.
Hi, I'm Katie Brownell with Red Hawk Rides Organics in Jefferson County, West Virginia. And tonight I'm going to be talking about using high tunnels in organic production. So we're going to talk about just general considerations when getting a hoop house. That's what I mostly am going to call them. They're called a few different names. We're then going to talk specifically about managing a high tunnel in the winter, in the spring and fall, and in the summer. And then we're just going to cover some other considerations as you are considering having a high tunnel on your farm in organic production. So let's start with what is a high tunnel. So a high tunnel is an unheated plastic covered hoop house. You can see in the back of this picture here, I've got a light image of our high tunnel on our farm. And primarily they're used for productions like ours, growing vegetables, flowers, fruits, etc. So what is the difference between a high tunnel and a greenhouse? There's two key or three key differences. High tunnels are going to be relying on passive solar radiation, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next couple slides, and natural ventilation for cooling and heating and temperature control, as opposed to having, a heat source and things like that. And seeds and seedlings, whereas a greenhouse is frequently the place where you're starting seedlings. In a high tunnel, seeds or seedlings are normally planted directly into the soil or in raised beds within the tunnel. And high tunnel frames are usually anchored directly into the ground instead of being anchored on a foundation, such as a concrete pad. So again, that's when you're planting directly into the ground. So it's basically you're putting a protected covering over one section of what would otherwise be the field in your farm. You will probably mostly hear me referring to high tunnels as hoop houses because that's just the term I use. They can also be known as passive solar greenhouses. So you may hear all of these terms. So how does a high tunnel work? And the real question here is, what is passive solar? So the way that the high tunnel works is that when sun enters the structure, because this is, clear plastic that's going to let sunlight through, what happens is the sun's going to enter the structure, it's going to bounce off the ground and anything inside and off the roof, and it kind of creates this situation where some of the sunlight and the heat is going to be getting trapped inside, and that is going to serve as the heating source. The sunlight and heat is also going to get absorbed into the soil. Soil is a huge thermal mass. You'll notice that the ground in the fall, the ground isn't going to immediately freeze as soon as we get temperatures below freezing. It takes a while because it's a dark surface that sucks in heat and sunlight. And so what the soil does in the hoop houses is going to store the heat during the day and then release it again at night. And because of this, the soil in a hoop house rarely completely freezes, like solid, hard frozen. And then passive solar also, you have to control this heat. So you're going to use things like doors, windows, roll up sides to help the heat travel and prevent the heat from building up too much. Or if you want to be keeping it in for colder weather days, you're going to be able to use venting to keep it as warm or as cool as you want it to be. So how does the high tunnel work continued? So some additional methods for controlling the heat, and we'll talk a little bit more and I'll show examples of this a little later, but you can also use internal covers as well as the external covers. So you can shut the hoop house and at night. So if we get temperatures below freezing, we're shutting the door, shutting the windows, rolling down the sides. But if we're getting very cold temperatures, like down into the 20s or below, then we're able to apply an additional layer of coverage inside. We use Rime, which you may also know as row cover. I've worked on other farms that use plastic, the same kind of plastic that you would put on the top of the hoop house. And because the internal covers are closer to the ground, they trap the heat from the soil in a smaller area, and therefore there's more heat in less space. So the space under that cover stays even warmer. So that's a technique to even further increase the warmth in the hoop house. Venting which is, opening the sides, opening the doors, opening the windows, is also going to help to control temperatures, humidity, and air circulation. All of this is very important, especially in disease control. Obviously, if you have a space that's, trapping sunlight and getting, moisture in it from the plants respirating and from watering the plants, you're going to get a very humid environment, which is going to be very conducive to diseases. So it's important to use the ventilation options that you have to both help control the heat, but also to prevent too many disease issues from developing. Other considerations when you're considering putting a hoop house in is where on your farm are you going to put the hoop house? How are you going to position it? So obviously sunlight is core to successful functioning of a hoop house. It's, the whole way that the hoop house operates is by trapping the sunlight. So it's really, you want to think about a spot on your farm that gets the most sun. It's best to orient the hoop house east to west so that one of its long sides is facing south and is going to get the most sun exposure. And regardless of anything else I say, you still need to grow smart in your hoop house. Like, hoop house isn't like a magic cure for anything. You want to grow plants that do well in the season you're growing them in. You want to be, and all the other considerations that we've talked about in all other parts of the farm, you're going to want to be considering those things inside the hoop house as well. So some benefits to hoop houses are that they offer more protection for the crops than in the open field. For instance, your crops are constantly covered. That means you're not getting rainfall. You're completely controlling the amount of moisture and the type of moisture that the plants are getting. This is why a lot of people grow tomatoes inside of high tunnels, because tomatoes are particularly susceptible to foliar or leaf diseases. And if you're growing crops inside a hoop house that tend to get leaf diseases, if they're not getting wet on the leaves because it's not raining, the amount of pressure that you're going to have from foliar diseases is going to be dramatically less. You're also just have much more control over the climate conditions. You can open and shut the hoop house as needed to control temperature and humidity levels, and you can water exactly as much as you need. You also, you may not. We personally see a less pest pressure in our hoop houses, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Another benefit of a hoop house is that you're just extending your growing season. And that's probably one of the most obvious benefits of hoop houses and the reasons people put them in. For us, we're able to start our growing season significantly earlier, and we are able to go with our growing season significantly later because we're able to put stuff in the hoop house and get a jump start on the season and get it growing before we would be able to get stuff in outside. We also see much higher yields per square foot in our hoop houses. And, I would say this is largely because it's such a controlled environment. It's less disease pressure. And we're also, because it's just a smaller space, we're able to just manage much. It's like those crops are almost babied. So you're getting the most out of that space as you can, because the crops are just getting a much gentler treatment than stuff that's out in the elements. So there are, of course, then downsides to high tunnels and hoop houses. One of the biggest ones is soil salinity. So salts would naturally build up in soils, but with heavy rainfalls, that flushes the salts out. And when you're not getting natural rainfall, you're going to naturally have the opposite result, which is that the salinity is going to build up in the soil, and this can have negative effects on crop growth over the years. So this is one of the reasons why it is not just recommended, but really necessary to remove the plastic from your hoop house some people leave it a little longer, every 3-4 years, so that you can let natural rainfall get into the hoop house to knock these saline levels down. Another reason that you have to remove your plastic is it's just like anything, it's going to start building up UV resistance over time as the plastic degrades, and therefore it's letting through less and less sun, and therefore, you know, the hoop house is just going to not do as good of a job of trapping sunlight and of letting sunlight in that the plants need. Other downsides of hoop houses are obviously you can just grow stuff in a field for essentially free. A hoop house, you're going to have to pay to get the structure, build the structure, and maintain the structure in a way that's just not the same when you're just growing out in the open field. One downside personally that I don't like is that you're using plastic, and the plastic is getting switched out regularly. And obviously, you know, putting plastic waste into the environment is not an ideal situation. Then there's also just overall maintenance that you have to do in hoop houses that's, you know, more intense than what you would have to do in the field. For instance, when over the winter, we basically can't travel if we have snow because somebody has to be here to knock the snow off the hoop house or it will collapse. In the field, it doesn't matter. It snows in the field, that's fine. But somebody has to be here to knock snow off, and you know, somebody has to be here to open and shut the hoop house to maintain the temperature and humidity levels regularly so that you're, you know, because one day forgetting to close it, forgetting to open it can really have some serious effects on the crops inside. So it is a more needy and intense system than just growing straight into the field. How to add a hoop house to your farm. So zoning regulations differ from area to area. There's a lot of places where you can just put a hoop house up. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. There's no regulations about it because they're considered non-permanent structures. In where I am in West Virginia, you actually do have to apply for a permit and pay fees. I just included the little blip that talks a little bit about the permits and documents that you have to apply. Here, you would just need to check in with your local municipality to find out the information about where you are. And then here is just a little bit of information that people can look at as they're going through this on different places to get hoop houses through. So cost of hoop houses was one of the factors I have already mentioned. They can range from under $1,000 to over $10,000, depending on the size and the features you're looking for. We have a 48 by 20 by 12 foot hoop house, which costs around $3,300. There are, however, and this is definitely something to look into, there are a lot of grants out there for farms that help you give funding to build a hoop house. And I've mentioned a couple of them here. And I would say, I used to be skeptical about this, and I've completely come around. Are hoop houses worth the cost? I would say absolutely. It's allowed us to make money earlier and later in the year, and it's allowed us to grow some of the crops, I would say specifically for us, peppers, just much more successfully in the hoop house than in the field. So factors to consider in the hoop house: you're going to need to be growing the right crops, cold tolerant or heat loving, depending on the season. You're going to still need to consider planting time. You're going to need to consider the management that we've talked about a little bit, protection, ventilation, watering, and you're going to need to consider harvesting them. In the summers or late spring, early fall, when it's not getting below freezing, you're going to be wanting to consider the fact that it's going to get a lot hotter in the hoop house a lot earlier in the day. You're going to want to get your stuff out of the hoop house probably before anything else, because that's going to heat up a lot more quickly. And in the winter, you're going to have to, and this becomes a major headache when you've got very cold weather in the winter and you're trying to harvest for a market or wherever you're selling, you obviously have to let the crops thaw before you can harvest them. And sometimes that means in the winter or the late fall, I am waiting to harvest until the afternoon because stuff hasn't thawed, you know, at the time of day I would normally harvest. You're also going to want to think about crops that you get multiple harvests off of. We grow a lot of baby greens in the hoop house. We grow, you know, peppers, which you're harvesting off of all year, and other things like that, because that space is obviously, if you're just talking about the cost per square foot of the ground that's covered by the hoop house versus the cost per square foot of the ground that's out in the field, the ground in the hoop house is just necessarily more valuable, and you want to be making more off of it because you've paid and invested to put this structure over top of it. So now we're going to get into some of the specifics. And I've put a lot of information in here because I know that some people are going to come and watch this after the actual presentation. And so there's a lot of written information available, as well as anything I'm going to say, so that, you know, if you just want to look at it, you can just go through and see what I've written down. So when are you going to want to plant for winter? So you really need to consider getting crops in while temperatures are still warm enough and the amount of sunlight is still long enough that crops will be able to grow. If you plant lettuce in December, it's probably just going to sit there barely germinated, if germinated at all, for the entire winter. In winter, hoop houses in many regions are not going to be growing environments. They're really going to act more like a living refrigerator. And so you need to get plants to grow to a point where they are ready to harvest before the growth slows or stops for the winter. I will say this caveat that as temperatures have gotten warm where we actually are having stuff that's continuing to grow through part of the winter. I think this last winter was one of the first years that we really experienced that. And you can see below some of the timing that we use for planting various crops in the hoop house, depending on how long they take to get ready. And so between October and November is really the tipping point for fall planting, at least where we are. Things planted early in October, you will be able to harvest those in late fall, early winter. We're doing our last plantings for stuff that we're planning to harvest for our December markets. We're doing those in the first half of October. If you're wanting to have stuff in your hoop house all winter that then you'll be able to start harvesting early in the spring, you can plant stuff, later than what we do. You can plant stuff into early November, and that stuff won't be harvestable through the winter, but you will be able to get a huge jump on selling and harvesting when the spring hits, because stuff will already be in the hoop house ready to start growing, as opposed to, putting seeds in the ground at that point where you're starting from nothing. What to plant for the winter. So the most important thing to consider when you're deciding what to plant in the winter is that plants, as you may know, there are plants that are frost tolerant. There's plants like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant that just cannot handle cold temperatures. And the reason this is that plants that can grow through the winter have the ability to do two things. They can move sugar into the water in their stems and leaves, that's going to lower the freezing point. So think about antifreeze in a car. They basically create natural antifreeze in their systems. And they're also able to transport some of the water outside of their cells into the membranes between the cells, so that if the water does freeze, and as we know, freezing water expands, the cells won't burst. You'll see, if you leave a pepper or tomato plant out through a frost, and you'll see the leaves almost look like kind of oily and wet. And that's because the cells have burst in that leaf from the freezing water. So plants that you can grow through the winter include things like kale, spinach, and brassicas. Those are extremely cold hardy. Head lettuce and salad mix also do quite well. And those all have this ability to transport water and to create their own antifreeze. You also want to consider light needs. So salad mix crops that you're just growing to baby leaf size, those do a lot better with lower light conditions in the winter, and I put my abbreviations. BSM stands for brassica salad mix, which is a salad mix made out of mustard and arugulas, and LSM is lettuce salad mix. So that's a salad mix that's all lettuces. And those just tend to deal better with low light conditions for getting through the winter. Winter watering is also, it's much more, you have to think about it a lot, because the hoop house is going to be closed more during the winter, which is going to allow moisture build up more. And so you want to make sure you're watering in a smart way, where you're getting the plants the water they need, because obviously they're going to need the water to be able to do those processes we just talked about. But you also don't want to be watering to the point where you are going to be creating disease problems due to the decreased ventilation in a winter hoop house, because it's not getting opened as much. So you're going to want to be, throughout the winter, checking the soil for moistness. It's sometimes hard to tell the difference between moisture and cold. And this is information from when I worked in Michigan. So that's definitely a colder climate than I'm in now. And there we're watering only 1 to 2 times a month. You want to be watering regardless of the setting you're in. If you're in a cold winter setting, you're going to want to be watering on a sunny day so that the moisture drives off the foliage before nighttime freezing. You're going to want to water earlier in the day for the same reason. You're not going to want to water plants that are still frozen. And you want to do as much as possible water at the base of the plants and not on the foliage. Obviously, this is completely impossible with many plants. You cannot just, unless you're using drip irrigation. I exclusively overhead water my baby greens, and that's just, they're fine. Things like head lettuce, I now run drip on that all year long because I was having issues with water getting into the kind of the cup of the inside of the lettuce and, freezing and damaging the leaves or creating rot and disease problems in there. So I talked a little bit before about internal covers. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but first I just have a picture of inside of our hoop house where you can see on the left is all the beds are covered with a second layer of Rime row cover. And then on the right, I've pulled it all off for the day. And so I will, on nights where the temperatures are getting, below freezing, I go out there in the afternoon, I pull all the covers over, I shut the doors, sides, windows, and before the sun has left the hoop house so that it traps heat inside. And then in the mornings, as it warms up enough and the sun is back on the hoop house, I then go out every morning, open the doors, open the windows gradually. You're going to want to pay attention to the temperatures. I open the door and window first, and then I'll gradually put the sides up as necessary in the winter and remove all the covers. There are going to be circumstances like days where it's, in the teens and it never gets out of the teens, where I might leave the hoop house, everything covered inside, and only just crack the door and the window. And I will talk a little bit more about how I make those decisions about venting in a little bit. So the use of internal covers, at any time of year when you're getting below freezing temperatures, this is something that you may want to consider. You're covering the beds with an extra layer. You want to make sure that the cover, whatever you're using, whether it be plastic or Rime, is getting all the way to the ground so that it is trapping that heat in and not going to cause, freezing that you don't want to happen. I like using Rime. On one of the farms I worked on, we used plastic. Plastic is 100% unforgiving. If you don't go out there and take the plastic off and the sun comes out, suddenly you don't have a greenhouse, you have an oven, and it's just going to bake everything. I like having Rime. If I have to run out and do something on a cloudy, cold day and the sun comes out, at least I know that the Rime is breathable and that the plants are going to make it through the rest of the day. So that's just kind of a personal decision in terms of what you want to do. By the same logic, the plastic is going to keep more heat in because it's not breathable. So, in our climate where we are, we don't need that. In other places where it gets much colder, that might be more necessary. So here is what I just kind of jumped into a little bit. I took these pictures in the winter, so unfortunately our roll-up sides are not rolled up, they're rolled down. But most hoop houses are going to have 3 different ways to vent it. We have a back window vent. We have roll-up sides, which I imagine at some point I'll get to a picture where you're able to see the sides actually rolled up, and those we manually roll up ourselves. And then we have a front door that we vent. Some farms also will have a window above the door in the front. We opted not to do that, but that allows you a little more nuance with your venting options. So you're going to want to look at your forecast. I basically know the forecast, like too much about the weather at all times, because you're going to need to make decisions like whether you want to store heat if there's an extremely cold night coming up, and that would mean you would want to vent a little bit less, or if it's going to continue to be mild or you're having disease issues, you may be wanting to vent more liberally. You want to be monitoring the temperature in the hoop house, not just what the forecast is. So you want to be keeping a thermometer in there. In the winter, I usually have one under the internal covers and one under the external covers. And I have a thermometer in there all year long so that I can be really keeping an eye on the temperature and, controlling how it is in there to as much degree as I can. So as I said, I used to work on a farm in Michigan, and this was the technique that they used. That climate is colder zone than we are here. So they were dealing with colder temperatures and were definitely having to vent slightly less to keep things warmer. This is my technique. I err on the side of overventing because I would much rather that my crops remain used to the cold and are not getting like coddled into thinking that they're going to be warm, because then they can be damaged if suddenly the temperatures really drop and they haven't stayed used to the cold temperatures. I also would much rather have stuff grow slightly slower than have a disease wipe out an entire crop. And so I vent much more in order to control air circulation and reduce disease pressure. I try in general to keep the hoop house in the 50s or so, or no higher than the 50s or low 60s in the late fall, winter, early spring. Obviously, sometimes it gets really warm outside and it's going to get warmer than that. But on cold days, I'm trying to not like let it get much warmer than that. I remove covers and vent by opening door, window, and rolling up the sides as needed to kind of keep these temperatures in that range. And another reason that you really want to be monitoring the temperatures is that a 20 to 30 degree fluctuation can actually cause plants to stretch, meaning that the space like between, like if you have a lettuce, the space between where each new leaf is coming out of the stem will get farther and farther apart. You may, hear people refer to that as plants getting leggy. And so trying to keep kind of a more moderated temperature is both going to help the plant remain comfortable with the colder temperature fluctuations, and it's also going to, keep them just more marketable by preventing the stretching. So yeah, I mean, like you can probably tell just by me talking is that managing the winter hoop house is very nuanced. You need to interpret anything I say here in the context of your weather, your climate, your plants you're growing, and disease and moisture factors that you are experiencing. So you may one year be venting a lot less, and then another year you may be struggling with a disease issue and be venting much more aggressively. So now we're going to move on to the spring. So for the spring, I start planting in February. In February, the sun's going to be starting to get higher in the sky and be up for longer, which is going to allow plants to start speeding up their growth a little bit more. Obviously, this is going to change with your growing zone. And plants are definitely going to grow slower, the ones that are planted in February. They're probably going to take about a month longer to reach maturity. But regardless of that, we are able to plant in the hoop house significantly earlier than we are in the field. And we're therefore able to go to market and start selling and start making back money much, much earlier by getting these very early hoop house plantings in. February 15th for me is my first and biggest spring planting date. This is all the stuff I put in on that date. And then things like arugula, baby brassicas grow a little faster, so they go in a week later. And then I succession plant after this. So things like head lettuce, baby greens, radishes, spinach that I'm harvesting multiple times off one bed or harvesting multiple beds. I'm going to be planting those, every week I think I plant for about 5 weeks in a row in the hoop house in the spring. So some management tips for hoop houses in fall and spring is, you're going to be doing a lot of rolling up and rolling down sides and venting to manage temperature swings, because there's just going to be much bigger swings at this time of year than in the winter or in the summer when temperatures tend to stay colder or hotter. So you're going to need to be managing the temperatures in the hoop house, depending on the type of crops you're growing. So you're going to want to keep it warmer. If you've got warm season crops, like right now, we're kind of beginning to transition our hoop house over from the cold season crops into warmer crops. Like I've just got the first beans in there. So as we move from these cooler crops where we're trying to, keep the hoop house a little cooler, or we're able to, we're now going to be trying to keep it a little bit warmer as we try to baby these warm summer crops along. Definitely keep an eye on your weather forecast to determine if and when you're going to need to open or shut it or use internal covers. This week, there's been some nights that we're having to shut it. Tonight, we don't have to. And so it's really hit or miss in spring and fall, and you really need to be monitoring the forecast. And the amount of time that the hoop house is open is going to increase as the spring moves towards summer and decrease as fall moves towards winter. So again, you're just monitoring when light is hitting the hoop house in the morning, when it's leaving the hoop house in the afternoon, and making decisions about opening and shutting based on both temperature and the amount of sunlight during the day. All right, we're moving into summer now. So when to plant for the summer. So each layer of plastic that you're using adds about 1 to 1.5 zones of warmth, which is pretty remarkable. So our zone has now changed from 6B to 7A, but that means that we can start planting summer crops in the hoop house in line with the planting dates that people would be using in zone 8. Which gives us a huge head start on if we were just planting out in the open field. Oh, I have one little side note on this slide that I think is worth considering, which is our final frost date is technically considered to be around the end of April, but we can get frosts as late as mid-May. And my recommendation that I always make is to assume that you are going to get that late frost. Because if you start all your stuff, you put all your summer stuff out there, and then you get that occasional late frost, you are going to be so much more upset that you lost all your summer stuff than you would be if you were harvesting that stuff 1 week later because you put it in slightly later. So that's my random farm recommendation for the day in the middle of the hoop house slideshow. So a little bit more about planting for the summer. What do you want to plant? That kind of depends. I've worked on farms that are exclusively putting hot weather stuff in the hoop houses in the summer. I've worked on farms that are using shade cloths. We do I don't know anybody else who does this, but we do a half and half where we put a shade cloth on half of the hoop house and leave half of it covered. And this has worked remarkably well. A shade cloth it's like, I should have put a picture of that in here actually. It's a black, kind of a black mesh looking cloth that just does what it says. It creates shade and you're able to actually get lower temperatures inside the hoop house with a shade cloth than the temperatures outside, which then means that we can grow stuff in the hoop house in the summer that we wouldn't be able to grow in the field. Some of the main things we grow in there are escarole and herbs. And then we have a half that doesn't have shade cloth. And this is where we're able to grow things that really like hot weather, or things that we want to get a longer harvest off of, or things that experience foliar diseases in the field. And so we get better success out of them in the hoop house. A lot of people grow tomatoes in the hoop house. We don't do that because we get more than enough from the field, but we do grow peppers and basil in the hoop house because both of those are very susceptible to foliar diseases. And we just find that we get a much better harvest off of them in the hoop house. We also grow cucumbers and beans because we're able to get them in very early in the hoop house. And then, we'll be harvesting them much earlier than we would in the field. And here I just put a little bit of info about tomatoes because I think a lot of people, that is what they have a hoop house for, is to get tomatoes in early. They're just already huge money makers. And so getting a longer harvest window and less disease pressure on them by growing them in the hoop house is a huge income increaser for a lot of farms. So summer venting and temperature control. In the summer, you're basically leaving your hoop house as totally full as you can. You want to be it's going to be getting hot in there. With the exception of having a shade cloth on, it will be getting extremely hot in there. So you want to be venting all the time, even on the parts that have shade, even on houses that have shade cloth on them. The exceptions are you want to shut it when it rains, because hoop houses, obviously the rain's not hitting the ground under the hoop house, it's all coming off the side. So think about a house with no gutters. You just are going to have rain pouring down and into the sides of the hoop house, and you're just going to flood the sides of your beds, knock the soil out if you don't shut the sides. Thunderstorms, I guess, kind of fall into both of these categories. Shut the sides if there's rain or there are high winds, because high winds can not only damage the crops, but that could, can rip the plastic right off your hoop house. Thunderstorms kind of cover both of those. They have rain and they have high wind. So shut it during a thunderstorm. I don't really roll the sides down for light rains, especially if it's hot or bright outside, because even like a hazy, bright day, your hoop house is going to heat up. It's like only if it's really cloudy that the temperature is not going to change in the hoop house. But I prioritize venting over warmth. And so I will leave it open if there's light rain. I will definitely roll it down if there's heavy rain. So watering. So this is the ideal world of watering. And then in the next slide, we will get to my actual watering. So this is what I learned about watering, is that, first of all, you want to know if a crop needs a lot of water or not a lot of water. Is it going to be a crop you're watering overhead, like a salad mix crop, or is it going to be something that you can run drip irrigation on? It's very important. Obviously, water is moisture. It doesn't create moisture, it is moisture. And the more moisture you have, the more likely you're going to have disease issues. So you don't want to be creating more moisture issues than you need to. So you have to be vigilant when you're watering, that you're not leaving hoses on, that you're not, blasting plants and blasting soil out of the bed, or creating rivers running through the hoop house that are just going to, create moist soil and potentially disease issues. You want to keep the beds evenly moist. Bed edges near the walls tend to get wetter because they're closer to the outside world and probably getting some rain fall into them, or, pulling in water from outside. Towards the center of the hoop house, it's usually going to be drier. And you're just going to want to be checking the soil moisture and deciding when to water. That is if you're operating in an ideal world. In my world, I've basically kind of figured out over the years the ways, like I say here, the first couple of years, I was very, very careful about watering, and I was following all those things. I was putting my hand in the soil. I was taking, little samples to see the moisture. After a certain amount of time, I just kind of figured out what the hoop house needs. I know about what each crop needs. I run drip on a lot more stuff now in the hoop house, so that the watering in there is much more controlled. And I've basically come up with a watering schedule that I am comfortable with, and I tweak it as needed just by daily observation of what's going on in there. So, all this to say that there's the way to do it, but you will develop your own ways over time, and just kind of figure out ways that work for you and that work for your farm and your setting. Crop rotation in the high tunnel. So we've talked about crop rotation before. It's definitely important in the high tunnel for the same reasons as in the field. It's going to help with pest, weed, and disease control. It's going to help with fertility and nutrient management, and kind of same area. It's going to help with soil health and soil structure. On our farm, we only have one high tunnel. So we rotate within the high tunnel and try not to have crops repeat within 3 years. Here are a few typical rotations in a bed. We plant every bed 3 times each year. And so over the course of 3 years, you might see this rotation. You'll see that in the fall and the spring, we have the same crop family in each year. I used to rotate that each year, and I actually realized I could get a longer rotation if I had the same crop in fall and spring, same crop family, and rotated the crop family every year. That allowed me to actually get a longer rotation between having the same crop family in the bed. If you have more than one high tunnel, you have the opportunity to rotate between tunnels the same way you would between sections on your farm. And this is an example from a farm that I worked on of how they rotated between their 4 high tunnels each year. So each one would get this mixture one year, and then the next mixture of crops the next year, and they would just rotate through those 4 tunnels. So now we're just kind of getting into the nitty gritty of, if you've got a hoop house, what do you do next? So how are you going to lay out your hoop house? How are you going to figure out crop spacing in your hoop house? So you can lay out, there's obviously different ways to lay out. A lot of people like the method that you can see in this picture where you're laying out long beds that are going straight, all the way straight down from one end to the other. It's just longer beds. You're prepping one long bed at a time instead of multiple small beds. And a lot of people really like this technique. I have mine, I mean, you've seen some other pictures. I have mine set up differently. You'll see that we have a center path and then we have shorter beds along the sides. The reason that I've chosen to do that is because the space closest to the sides of the hoop house, especially when we're talking about, I mean, primarily when we're talking about growing stuff in the cold seasons, that stuff is going to be it's going to be colder. It's warmer towards the middle of the hoop house. It's colder towards the edges of the hoop house. So if you have beds running straight all the way down, the way we saw in this last slide, those beds that are along the edge of the hoop house, that entire bed is going to be colder and grow more slowly. I made the decision to have beds running this way so that instead of having one crop that was in the side bed, the entire crop be affected by colder, every crop was kind of having the same impact across the bed. So there was areas of, so you're not just affecting one crop with the coldness. Things you want to consider should be maximizing the planting space and airflow while also making it easier to maneuver within the hoop house and maximizing the amount that you have planted in there. So planting and spacing, excuse me, planting and spacing in the hoop house. Hoop houses cost more money to build and manage than the field, like we already talked about. Therefore, you want to get the most money out of your hoop house as possible without compromising plant or soil health. So we achieve this in a few ways. I'm going to say the last point first, which is that we add compost to the hoop house before every single planting. In the field, we only add compost once a year. In the hoop house, we're adding the compost 3 times a year on most of the beds because most are getting 3 plantings a year. And that's because we're taking, we're planting 3 times. We don't plant 3 times in our field beds. So the soil in these beds is getting just much more use. It needs to get more refreshed. And we're also, because we hand manage in our hoop house and we do not cover crop in the hoop house, so we're not getting the added nutrients from cover cropping. So the additional compost really helps the hoop house maintain soil health. We also plant crops closer in the hoop house than we do in the field. And here are 2 examples. Peppers, we plant 2 rows per bed in the hoop house versus 1 in the field. And lettuce, we are able to plant at 8-inch spacing in the hoop house versus 12 inches in the field. And this is largely because of the more controlled environment and the decreased disease pressure that we're able to push things a little bit closer and therefore be making a little bit more money per square foot from the hoop house. And we talked about this a little bit, but we plant 3 plantings per year in the hoop house, and this is possible because the growing season's longer. Crops are trellised more aggressively, like we trellis cucumbers in the hoop house, but we don't really in the field. And this allows for narrower paths and increased space planted. And all beds in the hoop house are hand prepped, and we don't use the BCS or tractor in there. Some farms do bring BCSs and tractors into the hoop house. That's just not something we do, because by not having them in there, it allows us to have the beds closer together so that we're getting more off of the space. And it also further helps keep the soil in the hoop house healthy because of the more frequent plantings. By hand prepping, where it's just not as damaging to the soil as running machinery over it. Pests, diseases, and weed, the way you manage them, it's pretty similar in the hoop house. But the hoop house in and of itself is an example of the foundational or preventative tools that we talked about in the last webinar. Applications of water are totally under the farmer's control. It's hand managed and smaller, so it's much easier to remove weeds and to remove pests. And we have significantly less pest issues in the hoop house, and as we've talked about, significantly less disease issues because of the more controlled environment. So here is I had said we hand prep in the hoop house. These are the tools we use. This method of bed prep is sometimes called 1, 2, 3, 4 bed prep. So I put them in order from left to right of 1, 2, 3, 4. So one is called a broad fork. That's the one that has the 5 like tines sticking up, and that's used for like deep aeration of the soil. You stick it into the soil, step on it, and kind of move it back and forth, and it loosens the soil at a deeper level and allows air in at a deeper level. Then we run the next tool, which is called a cultivator through. That can also be used like a hoe for weeding, but in this case we use it to break up the more surface levels of soil and create a nice smooth seed bed for planting. Then we rake the beds out to get them nice and flat with a rake, and then we put on compost, like I had said before, every single planting, and rake that out. And we also do that on some outside beds when we're not using the BCS, but this is how we prep all of the hoop house beds before we start planting. Managing the soil in the hoop house. The hoop house tends to be a more intensively cropped system, as we've seen, which requires careful attention so as not to deplete soil health. Things that we don't or can't do in the hoop house is get natural rainfall. In our system, we can't cover crop and therefore can't get green manure. And we really do not leave beds without marketable crops growing in them for long periods of time because of it's just, there's money you put in the hoop house. You don't want to waste that space. That's valuable space. Things that you can do in the hoop house to help maintain soil health: rotate crops, apply compost at a higher volume and frequency, water regularly, remove plastic every year to allow rain to leach the salt in the soil, and apply peat moss to reduce pH, which can become unbalanced by irrigation without rainwater. As always, the most important thing you can do is just, like I said in the last lecture, is the farmer's footprint. You just want to be constantly monitoring to observe changes in plant health, soil structure, appearance, etc., and be making your decisions about watering, venting, temperature, all of that based on what you are observing in your system. And the last slide I wanted to show is just some examples of different types of hoop houses that are available as you're considering whether to get a hoop house for your farm. The type that we have, and this is a picture of our hoop house, you can see the sides are a little bit rolled up there, is called a Quonset. And these are the rounded hoop houses. They're the least expensive. They're okay if you don't get a huge amount of snow. If you are in an area that gets much more snow, you may want to consider the Gothic one, which is the more arched shape, and snow really just slides off of those. And they also are, they tend to be taller structures, which are therefore going to have, more space in them to grow crops that get tall, like tomatoes, and also going to just be more space for heat to build up in. Another option that one of the farms I worked on had is rolling hoop houses, which you can see the little wheels on this picture on the very right. These are ones where you can roll the whole structure from, like, you have the structure here, you can roll it down to these beds for part of the year, then you can roll it back to these beds for another part of the year. And that's great for crop rotation and for starting stuff in the hoop house early that then you don't want to or need to maintain cover over the whole year. So you can just move those right, out to the open field just by rolling the hoop house off of it. And that is all that I have for today. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
I do. This is Denise from the Farmers Market Association.
Sure.
I always have questions. I have a high tunnel.
Yes.
It is a Gothic style. And
yes.
Last year we had several inches of snow, and it actually cleaned off the plastic when the snow just dropped off. It cleaned off the top of the plastic because there had been a lot of pollen buildup on it from previous years. And I was like, oh, goody, that's wonderful. So the other thing I wanted to ask you, though, is do you not use a fertigator at all?
No.
You only use compost? Okay.
Only use compost, yeah.
Okay.
I use fish emulsion when I'm transplanting. Like, all transplants get fish emulsion on them before they go into the ground, but otherwise our only fertility source in the hoop house is, composting.
Okay. And that's compost you make yourself, or do you get it from
No,
somewhere?
we purchase compost. The in that picture, that's that is Leaf Grow, which is made by like the Maryland Department of the Environment or something like that. And that we will get, usually for the hoop house, we'll get the bags of that because it's a much finer compost. In the field, we purchase bulk leaf mulch from like a local garden center. That stuff's a little coarser. So in the hoop house, where we're doing a lot of crops that are getting directly seeded into the soil, we use this finer stuff because it's easier to seed into it.
Okay. Do you have any kind of deer netting on the sides, or do you ever have any problem with deer trying to stick their head in or come
We
in?
have our entire farm is deer fenced. Yeah,
Okay.
that's actually a good thing. It's a thing that I didn't even mention in the last one when we were talking about pests is, yeah, like deer pressure is obviously a huge issue. Deer groundhog pressure. That was something that I had experienced a lot on previous farms. So I was like very adamant that that was something we had to put in when we started the farm here. So we have, I can't remember what company we have it through, but it's not like the wooden post metal fencing. It's like we did it all ourselves. It's just, metal posts that we put in with a post pounder, and then it's like essentially chicken wire that's got a like a rubberized coating on it, and that, that's surrounds our entire farm, and then it, has a skirt out on it so the deer can't get underneath it. So therefore we don't have to worry about them in the hoop house because they can't get into any of the farm.
Right. And do you ever use insect netting on the
Yeah.
sides or?
On the sides, I don't. I use it on specific beds. I use a variety called Protect Net, and I use that on pretty much all brassicas once it gets. I mean, this year I've already started putting it on because it's so warm. But usually, yeah, in the summer I have everything under insect netting. In the hoop house, though, I don't have to net stuff for the most part. For whatever reason, the hoop house, the brassicas in the hoop house, they just don't get the same amount of insect pressure as they do in the field.
Okay. I had a real problem one year with when I had deer netting and no um, screen or anything over the plants or on the sides. I had a real problem with those hornworms on my tomatoes. And
Yeah. Our first year, we had a huge issue with hornworms, and over the years, just you know, the biodynamic ecosystem that we've created here, we've gotten enough of the braconid wasps, which are what parasitize the hornworms, that we just don't have hornworms hardly at all. I mean, we do, but they all get parasitized like very quickly. But yeah, the first year we had a huge issue with hornworms.
yeah. And I would say too, when you're buying plants, if you're not raising them yourself, make sure that when you buy them from the greenhouse, that you kind of flip the leaves and make sure there aren't any white flies or aphids. I've had that problem as well, bringing stuff into the high tunnel and then having screen on the outside, and it's like a buffet. So,
Yeah. So, and on the topic of hornworms and hoop houses, when I was in Michigan, there was a farm that we visited where the person, they actually shut, and through the summer, like they would shut the hoop house every night, completely shut it, because hornworms are, they're the larva of a moth. And
right,
so if you shut it, at night, then they're never going to be able to lay their eggs in there because they can't get in because they're nocturnal.
right.
I have a fun fact about hornworms. They fluoresce
Yes, they
under
do.
black light. It's
Yes,
easy
they
to find
do.
at
That's cool.
It's fun.
night. Mm-hmm.
That's how I knew I had a terrible problem, because they're much easier to see at night when they're tiny, especially. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they just shine like fluorescent, just like here I am, and they're easy to pick
That's
and
right.
get rid of.
Send the
Okay,
kids on a treasure hunt. Put a bounty
right.
on them.
Right. That is all the questions I have. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I
Okay.
just had a comment. I have a high tunnel, and I really thought this is a really good, hey, really good presentation. Just a minute. Um, I mean, I was just nodding along with everything. I think I would add that the buildup of salt in an organic system is much less of a problem than it is in a conventional system. Um, with
Yeah,
synthetic fertilizers,
yeah,
and things like that, you tend to get those things building up a lot more.
yeah.
And in organic production, uh, I mean, I haven't had any issues. I really don't know other organic producers that have had the salt buildup problems that have, I mean, just kind of ground a lot of conventional farms to a halt
Mm-hmm.
in their high tunnels.
Right.
So there's one thing that being organic can make easier. Yay.
Yes, definitely. Okay. We're out of time, it looks like. Our next virtual discussion will be May 14th at 7 p.m. And the topic will be taking the worry out of inspection. And then we also have a hands-on workshop in Shepherdstown on June 1st in the Bird Science Center on the East Campus of Shepherd University. So that should be a really good time to, meet people face to face and get some more information about organic production and growing. So thank you very much, Katie, for a great presentation as always. And thank you, Julie and Sarah, for attending. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.